Good evening. I'm Sandy Waters, President of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. Tonight's debate will feature a discussion among the Republican and Democratic candidates for the BET. We are broadcasting from the Town Hall meeting room in Town Hall on Field Point Road. There can be no recording and use of this event without the League's permission, except for the press who are attending to cover it. Please allow me to thank Becky Gillen, who was the organizer of this event, Kay Maxwell, who is our moderator, Arjun Kishore is a Greenwich High School student and our question asker, Don Conway, Horst Tebby, and all the crew at GCTV for cameras and YouTube recording. Thanks to the Town Hall staff, especially John Thompson, Steve O'Hurley, and Tammy Warren, and to our 4 League timers. The Board of Education is one of the town's most important governing entities. The League has created a 3-minute video which explains what the BET does and how a voter can influence its decision-making. Thanks to Hagar Jamali for helping us create it.
Hey everyone, I'm Hagar Jamali and I'm here to tell you that it's an election year. I know what you're thinking and you're like, no, oh my God, not again. Yes, again. In Greenwich, municipal elections happen in all odd-numbered years, just in time after you've recovered from the last hoopla. In the past, less than 50% of registered Greenwich voters participated in our local municipal elections. So you thinking of skipping this year's election? Think again. We need to vote in our local elections because it's how we get decision makers who literally influence our daily lives here in Greenwich. This year, the town's powerful financial board, which is called the Board of Estimate and Taxation, also known as the BET, will be elected for 2 years and 2 budget cycles. The BET controls all town spending for every town department. So for example, do you own a home? Well, the BET controls the mill rate and your property taxes. Do your children attend a public school, or maybe you feel like the school needs upgrades? The BET controls all capital spending in the school's budget. Or are you frustrated with waste or penny pinching in town spending? The BET sets the town operating budget and borrowing policy. Okay, so clearly I've convinced you to get out and vote, but how do you vote for the BET? Well, it's complicated. Democrats nominate 6 to serve. Republicans nominate 6 to serve. Unless there's a primary, all 12 nominees will be seated. It's a real nail-biter. On the election day ballot, unless you're involved with a political party or there's a petition candidate you support, you have nothing to say about who will sit on the BET. I know I'm really convincing you right now. What you control is which party has the most votes to pass its agenda. And the political party whose candidates receive the most votes in total chooses the BET chair. And that person has a tie-breaking vote. So one more time for the people in the back. The political party whose candidates receive the most votes gets to choose the BET chair. And that person is really important because they have a tie-breaking vote. I am not here to tell you which party to vote for. I'm just here to tell you to get out and choose one. Now, I know this is a small town, and you might know people running, but this is not a vote for high school president. So make sure to learn about candidates' policies and vote for the people whose policies you support. So quickly to summarize. First, get out and vote. Second, get out and vote. And third, pick me up a coffee along the way. In October, the League of Women Voters of Greenwich will publish a voter's guide on their website, and it'll include all the information you need on the candidates and voting. You can also follow the League of Women Voters of Greenwich on Facebook, and me at Hagar Jamali on Facebook and Instagram, and we'll make sure to share and link to the guide and remind you to go vote. In the meantime, get excited to voice yourself and make your opinions count.
Now I'd like to turn the podium over to Kay Maxwell, who will moderate, and Arjun Kishore, who will deliver the questions.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our purpose is to provide you with an opportunity to hear the views of the Democratic and Republican candidates running for the Greenwich Board of Estimate and Taxation. Participating in this evening's debate are the 6 Republican and 6 Democratic candidates. Members of each party are seated together, and based on the drawing ahead of time, a Democratic candidate will be the first to respond to the first question and the first to deliver closing statements. The format is designed to allow time to discuss the issues. The only rule is that the total time used by each party, not each candidate, by the conclusion of the debate be approximately the same. The questions will be posed this evening by Greenwich High School student Arjun Kishore, but the questions themselves have come from the public. The candidates will not be restricted to 1 or 2 minute responses. Instead, they can spend as little or as much time as they feel is appropriate, within reason, of course, to discuss each issue. The parties will take turns being the first to respond to a question, and the order of seating within each party was decided by the candidates themselves. Following the question period, 2 candidates from each party will make 3-minute closing statements. And as was mentioned, members of the League of Women Voters are serving as timers, and they are going to keep me and the candidates informed of the time that's been expended by each party. Obviously, if a serious imbalance should occur during the course of the debate, I'll call it to your attention and we'll get it corrected. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the candidates for the BET. To my immediate left are the Democratic Party candidates, and they are David Weisbrod, Miriam Kreutzer, Stephen Selbst, Laura Erickson, Jeff Raymer, and Leslie Moriarty. To their left are the Republican candidates, Karen Fasiliotis, Dan Ozizmir, Leslie Tarkington, Mike Basham, Nisha Aurora, and Bill Drake. And so now to the debate. And the first candidate to respond will be Mr. Weisbrod from the Democratic Party. So Arjun, please pose the question.
What urgent capital projects can be fast-tracked if we use American Recovery Plan funds to pay for them?
Thank you. And before I get to the question, I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this debate tonight. Sandy Waters, you, Arjun, for your questioning, Kay Maxwell as moderator, and Hagar for the wonderful video that she put together. While I'm thanking, I should also thank the teachers and all of the safety staff within the community, within the town, that have kept us all safe and on track during the COVID situation. So I think the question about prioritization is an excellent one. The role of the BET is to appropriate money and to spend it in terms of what the community wants to have. We're in a position in Greenwich where we have a little bit of wind at our back. And the wind at our back is due to a number of things. We're a wealthy community with a $33 billion grand list that keeps growing and hopefully will continue to grow. And the additional wind at our back are these ARP funds that are coming via Washington. So there are $32 million of ARP funds headed into the town of Greenwich, plus an additional $10 million for the Board of Education for the schools. And so the question about prioritization really is a reflection of the needs of the community. What are the priorities of the town of Greenwich? We've heard much late from both the student body, the school, the parents, and the needs of our schools are quite well known, have been documented well. There's a lot of deferred maintenance on these schools. They're very old and they need to be fixed, and they need to be fixed quickly. A lot of it has been deferred over too many years. But it's not just the schools, it's also flooding that we're all experiencing in these days, whether through Ida or other events. And so the ARP money can and will, I'm sure, be used to address the priorities that the community has set out and states are the things that they need. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Fasiliotis, you're the first to respond to the same question.
Thank you. Recently, the first selectman convened a committee that consists of 4 BET Budget Committee members, the Commissioner of Human Services, the town administrator, and he chairs the committee. Now, I'm not sure if everybody realizes, but Greenwich will receive $32 million for the town, and I think it was mentioned $10 million for the schools for spending that qualifies for ARP funds. The BET and the RTM will need to approve all appropriations or spending of these funds. The Board of Education has a separate process for their funds, and quite frankly, we feel that the best use of these funds, at least initially, will be for water and sewer and drainage. After Ida, it's very clear that people in our community are suffering, and the water, sewer, and drainage infrastructure is particularly acute. This also addresses property values in a way that doesn't increase our taxes and debt. Improved HVAC in the schools, which was identified as one of the priorities in the master plan for the schools, would also qualify and should be considered for upgrades as the funds are coming in.
All right, is there a response? Yes, I'll leave it to you. Go ahead.
So just to add a little bit more information to that, there are limitations on how the town is permitted to use the funds for ARP. We need to use them for, in infrastructure, it's just water, broadband, and air quality. However, we can use the funds additionally to counter the negative effects of the pandemic on certain populations and businesses. So as Ms. Vasiliotis identified, there's a committee formed to at least identify an initial set of specific projects that will then go through a public vetting process. But they do fall into the categories of affordable housing contribution to the trust, air quality projects, stormwater and sewer projects, and then the negative impact projects that might go directly to individuals and nonprofits.
Anyone on the Republican side want to add something to this? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, good evening. I'm Leslie Tarkington. Yes, as it's been said here, the Budget Committee members will participate in these decisions. It's important that everyone understand there are very constrained requirements for the use of these funds. And so one of the areas that we're targeting or looking at is certainly our Grass Island sewer plant, as well as the storm drainage issues that have been raised by our storms. Approximately a decade ago, the town experienced 3 storms, and the town was able to use the resources that it had built to recover from those storms. In this case, in terms of drainage, it creates opportunities to use the funds for such things. And not only are there accepted and approved constraints on the use of the funds, afterwards there'll be an audit, and that audit may not come soon. So, we all have to be cognizant of the requirements that will definitely have to be evaluated and recognized for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, the next question, and Mr. Ozizmir, you'll be the first to respond. Arjun, the question?
How do you assess the capital needs of Greenwich Public Schools? How would you address and fund these needs?
Thank you. Thank you. In terms of assessing the capital needs of the Greenwich Public Schools, I think we have to start with the analysis that was funded and done a few years ago from KD&G about a master plan for the school system. Everyone is probably aware that, we've been talking about capital in Greenwich for the schools for years and years. And a few years back, it was understood that to really organize that discussion, it was important to fund a comprehensive survey of the needs. If you look at the study, I think you'll see some common themes. One of the themes was there was a lot of deferred maintenance, and the spending for maintenance had to increase. That was really one of the core findings. The second was there are certain areas like security, air quality, ADA access that were really badly in need of focus. Clearly every school is different, but for example, a school like Old Greenwich has very significant ADA issues. Air quality was highlighted a few years ago. Interestingly, with COVID, that's become much more critical. And, we just talked about the American Rescue funds, and I think it's important to note that I think it would be a great place to put those funds to really accelerate that. And when we talk about air quality now, we're not really just talking about more air conditioners and moving more air. There's a lot of significant and new technology about how air can be cleaned and kept safe. Because I would also note that in the American Rescue Plan funds, one of the key uses is to prepare for the next pandemic in case it happens. And then the last area really of significant concern was Central Middle School. And Central Middle School, of all the schools, is the one that is least structurally sound. So there are many, many points in that report, and obviously everyone can take a different angle on them. But if you look at the key pieces, it's increased maintenance, it's HVAC, ADA, and then lastly, Central Middle School. So in terms of how I would approach this on the BET, I'm going to be new to the BET. I think that we need to obviously start with the master plan that I just talked about, and then the priorities of the Board of Ed. And I would also add that we also have to look at enrollment, right? When the master plan was done, the expectation is enrollment in Greenwich schools would be increasing. And we've certainly seen over the last few years that enrollment has fallen by almost 500. If you look back over 20 years and you look at enrollment trends, this decrease was not only unexpected, it's really unprecedented. We've never seen anything close to this in the past. The good news is that means from an operating point of view that the spending per pupil is going up, and that's, I think, a good thing. It also means, though, that we need to be very careful about how we allocate the capital dollars. So, my sense is that, the three priorities I mentioned are kind of where I would certainly start. And I would also say that I attended some of the original meetings with the architects, and one of the big questions that was asked is, should we do Central first because it has the greatest need, or should we defer Central for over a decade and try to do other schools first? Again, I wasn't on the Board of Ed or the BT, so I had no vote on that. But, in listening to the discussion, I really got a sense that, how that decision was made to put Central off an extra 10, 12 years from kind of another possible approach. There may have been many reasons for it, but I think one of them was a concern that maybe we couldn't take on $120 million of debt, right? But the fact is, if you look at our debt policy and you look at the really prudent way this town has managed debt, the fact is we could do that if we had to. And if I just look at what I'm seeing in terms of the issues at Central Middle School, I certainly would ask that question get asked. Of course, it is not the BET's decision as to what project is proposed, but that would be the framework that I would think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kreutzer, same question.
Thank you very much. In terms of the capital master plan put forth by the Board of Ed, that plan came out in 2018. We're sitting here in 2021, and we've started just one of those projects, which was the Greenwich High School entryway. The way to get this project done is actually get it done and stop deferring these capital projects that come from the Board of Ed from year to year. In the last 2 years, the Board of Ed did put forward, for example, the Julian Curtis School. And by a party line vote, my Republican colleagues, those with whom I served at the time, decided to defer that particular project. So I say the first and foremost is the way to sort of prioritize and move forward is actually to take that plan, which has been prioritized, and move forward with it, and to stop putting roadblocks in its way. The other thing is that I completely agree with Mr. Ozasmir that we need to listen to the Board of Ed. So the first selectman a few years ago decided to abandon its CIP process, its capital improvement program process. And part of that, it gets feedback not only on the town side for capital projects, but also on the Board of Ed. The Board of Ed decides what the pecking order is in terms of its projects, and we need to let them be in their lane. They are duly elected officials. We are the BET. We should not have a say as to how the Board of Ed conducts its information or how it conducts its prioritization. Again, with regards to Julian Curtis, it was particularly troubling that one of the reasons that we decided to defer the full $1.7 million to continue the renovation of Julian Curtis was because the members of the BET didn't particularly like the education specs as defined by the Board of Ed. Not our lane. And we should let the Board of Ed do their jobs. I would also say that with that in mind, we should also be open to receiving new info as to the state of the schools and the worries that the Board of Education has. So case in point, again, Mr. Ozasmir mentioned Central Middle School. The superintendent, as you know, came in a couple of years ago. The chief operating officer also came in a few years ago, and they took a look at Central Middle School and they said, wow, we're going to spend $20 million in the next 5 years to maintain this particular school, in which is slated in 10 years to be completely knocked down and rebuilt. Maybe that doesn't make sense. And more importantly, the state of the school is worrisome. How about we ask for $105,000 to the Board of Ed in this budget to get a better sense as to whether this is at worst at best a money pit, and at worst a real danger to the children that are in that particular school. And again, by party line vote, my Republican colleagues on the BET, the last budget cycle, decided to cut that. So again, we have, the Board of Ed has prioritizations. We need to take those facts into our prioritization in terms of when we decide to move forward. But we also have to be open to taking in this new information. In terms of how we also get this done, we need the full toolbox available to us as a financing board here in town as to how we go forth and pay these projects. Many other towns have many large projects as well. Darien is running 3 projects concurrently. There's a way to do this, and we have the tools to do this. We just choose not to very often. So that's my full answer. Thank you.
All right, and one of the Republican candidates, yes, go ahead.
Okay, just to begin with, every one of us wants high-quality schools. There's no question about that. Everyone agrees on this dais that we need to spend money on our schools and our school infrastructure. Anyone who says differently would be lying to you. The only debate that's being held is which building gets rebuilt first, and should we be building more new classrooms in the face of long-term continued declining enrollment. Some people don't want us to ask those questions and want to hide this information from the public. Others are being prudent with your money. The BET hired experts who issued a report which cost you, the taxpayer, $500,000. We met with the BOE cooperatively, and the experts went through their findings. The experts identified 3 priorities for their schools. We're not spending enough on school maintenance, CMS needs to be replaced, and all buildings have to have indoor air quality, access for the disabled, and security issues. The BOE is not following the recommendations of the report. Instead of addressing the priorities, the BOE plan is to update one school at a time for a period of 20 to 30 years. I'm unwilling to wait 20 to 30 years to update air quality and access for the disabled. I'm not willing to let our kids sit in buildings with dirty air and our teachers having to carry disabled children up and down the stairs. I'm also unwilling to build more classrooms in the face of declining enrollment. So yes, I don't agree with the outgoing board chairman's contention that we should update his neighborhood school over the others. As soon as the BOE brings forward a plan that addresses air quality, access for the disabled, and security in a few short years instead of decades, I will be the first to approve it. Until then, I will keep pushing the BOE to do so. It's simply not fair that our families with kids in the school system have their kids sitting in buildings with unacceptable air quality and no access. Now, with respect to CMS and our delay of those problems, it's kind of interesting because in 2019, the current Democratic caucus chair made a motion to delete the funding for Riverside School feasibility study, and that project was deleted from the budget. In the same year, the feasibility study was deleted on motion by the current Democratic caucus chair for the renovation expansion of Old Greenwich feasibility study. Yet when Republicans did the same thing for Central Middle School, because the school is not being planned for another 11 to 12 years, we are vilified for doing so. If the BOE had changed their priorities and placed Central Middle School at the top project for their funding, it would have been approved without question. But the school is not scheduled according to the outgoing chairman, who has said on numerous occasions for at least 11 years at best. So who knows what will happen in 11 years. You will have to draw your own conclusions. Thank you.
All right, someone from one of the Democratic candidates, yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This is a really important question, and I think among the many issues that we are going to discuss tonight, this is perhaps the key differentiator between our two parties. I'm going to go in reverse order. With respect to the A&E funds that Ms. Vasiliotis just discussed, that was a combined $524,000 feasibility study, or A&E money, for 3 schools. The BET Budget Committee and the full BET at that time decided that the process should be followed as it normally is, which is to do A&E the year before a school project is anticipated. The thinking being that if you do all the A&E studies at the same time, as time goes by, they get stale. So I think it was a 10-1 vote. It was a bipartisan vote to do it the way we normally do A&E before we proceed with further school construction. I want to talk about enrollment because it is an issue that we all should be thinking about. But I do take exception to this is unprecedented. This is normal. Birth rates decline, they go back up. This is how demographics works. The town has gotten in trouble before when it sold Byram School, and then we were in a pinch. We have closed schools in the past. Parkway is one of them. Dundee is another one, and we've since reopened them when enrollment called for it. We have a neighborhood school model. This is the model that our community desires. There is no question that the Board of Ed is going to have to wrestle with this issue, and I hope they will. And it indicated at their meeting the other night that they will certainly do that. We need to look at the number of sections. We need to look at how our education is delivered. We also need to remember that our student population who have special needs or who qualify for free and reduced lunch or who qualify for English language learner services exceeds 30%. So the needs of the students must come first when we evaluate our delivery of educational services. Lastly, I just want to talk about the capital needs. I think it's really important, and there always historically has been a good dialogue between the BOE and the BET. There needs to be a partnership. And by the way, the first selectman is part of that because he prioritizes the capital budget that is submitted to the BET. So that will continue, and I'm sure there will be robust discussions. But the Board of Education is charged with the prioritization. Julian Curtis School, Old Greenwich School, Riverside School was their order of priority. Julian Curtis School was built a long time ago. The common spaces are undersized. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it needs attention, as does Old Greenwich, as does Riverside, and certainly as does Central. No one disagrees that Central needs attention. And let's not forget Western Middlefields, who have been closed for years. And I think we all agree on both sides of the aisle that as soon as we get the approvals, we're going to move forward with that. I guess in summary, I think the Democratic members of the BET have shown via their voting record where they stand on school funding. And I hope the voters can do some fact checking and figure out where they align with most on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, and the first to respond will be the Democrat, Mr. Selbst. Arjun, the question.
If the town's school infrastructure is valued at $1 billion, what do you think is an appropriate annual maintenance budget?
I'll be straight up.
Excuse me, is your microphone on? Sorry.
Sorry, not used to the format. I'll be straight up. I don't have the command on those kinds of figures that some of my colleagues do. What I do insist upon, as Laura Erickson just said, is that we fund the schools in a way that's commensurate with the needs. And I think there is bipartisan agreement about that. I studied a lot about this budget. I can't say that I had the answer to what the maintenance needs are, but what I am quite insistent on is that we address the issues. And I think capital needs for the school are the most urgent issue. And therefore, to the extent that there are identified needs for capital improvements, including maintenance, including the ADA issues, including the air quality issues, we have to tackle those issues. I listened to the first selectman debate the other night, and the candidates were talking about what the conditions are at CMS. I did not realize, and I was astonished to hear, that there are actually building sensors on the curtain wall, that's the exterior wall, at Central Middle School to manage and keep an eye on the extent to which that curtain wall is moving. I'll admit I'm a tyro, I'm a newie. I'm a newcomer to this process, but it's astonishing to me that we have a school system where we have monitors on the curtain walls. I ask the voters, would any of you be comfortable if there were curtain walls on your homes to monitor the movement? And to me, that really illustrates the need to accelerate the capital spending on the schools. To me, that is, there are many priorities within this town, and certainly there are other competing uses for our capital, but to me, the physical condition of the schools is the most. And while I don't have the answer as to the exact dollars of maintenance, I think that as Ms. Erickson has said, the message is clear. We must fix our schools.
All right, and the same question to Republican candidate, Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, again, thank you to the League of Women Voters for having this forum and debate this evening. Infrastructure, whether it's school or town, is a very important issue for me and one which I've supported. We have not actually looked at numbers, whether it's town or schools, and how much it should be a year, but what's needed to be done, taken the recommendations from in this case, the school's person responsible for construction, engineering, and those kind of things, and I think pretty much followed what's needed. And every year, there are multiple applications for many things, whether it's for HVAC, there was asbestos at one point, cleanup for that, many aspects. The safety and security has been part of it, et cetera, et cetera. So it is different than the private sector, where you might actually look at this and you would have depreciation and you would try and match your depreciation. The buildings themselves are probably constructed over depreciated over 40 years or longer. But we have not taken that perspective, because even the projects we put together, it isn't just the buildings, it's what's within them. There has been a regular program for replacement of roofs and for electricity upgrades. I mean, obviously, doing the schools individually for LED lighting and other such, plumbing upgrades. So I think that those are, been critical needs. And, I think they have been prioritized as it's been presented by the schools. But I do have to comment here that while we, are very supportive of these and I think embrace it, some of these projects now become multi-million dollars each, like the HVAC projects. And we've asked the schools to just not to reduce the numbers, but break them into the individual components, HVAC for North Street or other schools. But while we look at all of this, and I think have been, again, attentive to delivering the funds and support needed to maintain the schools as such, we also can't forget that, currently there's almost about over $50 million of schools projects that have been appropriated and money's yet unspent. So that's well over 100 projects, probably more like 110, 112 at this point in time. So it's really it's critically important we take that into consideration. Also, once we start a project, there's a certain distraction level. So one of the items that have been very important to me is that we begin to clean up our schools in terms of, the major projects, getting our certificates of occupancy, and making sure that we're on top of it. Only on school building projects, only after that is received can we then begin to apply to the state for the funding for our schools programs and the final audit. So, those things are now in process for Hamilton Avenue School, Glenville School, Mesa, and New Lebanon School. So it's a larger project, and we're pleased to be able to support the schools. Thank you.
All right, one of the Democratic candidates, you choose between the two of you.
Thank you. I think I was assigned schools, so I'll take this question. I'll be very brief. So the answer to the question is that we have about 1.5 million square feet of real estate among the 15 school buildings, plus we have the headquarters at Havemeyer. We should spend about $12 to $15 million in annual maintenance. We probably in some years should have spent more, but because of larger capital projects, that figure was suppressed to maybe $8 to $10 million, which was too little. Maintenance saves us money in the long term. If we properly maintain our assets, we will not have to do expensive fixes later when things break or there's a crisis. I think we all learned that with Hamilton Avenue. We've also learned recently from some unfortunate flooding events that it's appropriate to put in place risk mitigation measures such as water bugs to detect water. So I think on this score, we can all agree that maintenance is money well spent and we have to arrive at the proper level. Thank you.
On the Republic, pardon me, Ms. Aurora?
Yeah, I'd like
Republican?
thank you. I'd like to just comment, and it's come up a little bit, the prioritization, and, I think we heard just now in the answer that Central Middle perhaps has monitors and serious structural deficiencies, and I think I heard someone on the other side say it's not our responsibility to prioritize. Well, if someone is not asking the right questions, we do need to prioritize. Let me share some numbers. I think I heard saying that enrollment has declined 5% or so, and that's with national trends. Yes, that's correct, but let's look at the real numbers. In our elementary schools, we saw a decline of 10%. In Julian Curtis, we saw a decline of 29%. Yes, that's correct. So if the Board of Ed right now is going to prioritize an elementary school that has declined in enrollment 29%, for a price tag of $27 million to add 5,000 or 6,000 square feet, yes, we're going to ask questions and we're going to demand, are we prioritizing this correctly? And prioritization of our capital school projects is not the only issue here. The other problem and the other issue we really have to address is some of these numbers. And again, I've heard a couple times, let's stay in our lane. The ed specs are being provided by the Board of Ed, and we just need to close our eyes and put a stamp on this. No, that's not okay. Let me tell you what the price tag is for Central Middle, which, some of us could argue, including myself, that perhaps that should be top of our priority list, even in hearing some of the comments. The price tag for Central Middle is $125 million. That's for 80,000 square feet. That's roughly $1,500 a square foot. Now, I don't know how many of you have been involved in real estate projects or anything of that sort. Let me give you numbers nationally, what those look like, dollar per square foot numbers. In the city of Chicago, it's 2021 numbers. In the city of Chicago, it costs somewhere around in the low 300s per square foot to do an elementary school construction. In Boston, $400 a square foot. In New York, $500 a square foot. Why in Greenwich, Connecticut are we spending $800 a square foot renovating projects and $1,500 a square foot to propose new builds? These are some things we have to ask questions, and we have to help our Board of Ed ask these questions and reprioritize.
All right, thank you. Now you each only get one chance, so we move to the next question. Yes, again, just to cover the rules, the question is first answered by either a Democrat or Republican, and then each side can have one rebuttal. So I think we've had both. So the first to answer this question, Mr. Basham, Republican, and Arjun, the question is?
Interest rates are at a historic low. Are there any arguments against short-term borrowing when rates are so low? And if so, what are the arguments?
Excuse me, did I hear you correctly? Arguments against borrowing short-term with rates this low?
That's correct.
Are there arguments against borrowing short-term with rates this low, which means it's cheaper to borrow, period? Okay. The borrowing issue is really one about spending. To the extent that people want to spend more, they are in favor of longer-term debt, and the argument they will make, where rates are low now, we should extend the debt now. The benefit of that is principal payments are lower, it reduces impact on taxes, and what it does is it pushes the cost off into the future. Those who prefer shorter-term debt are concerned more about the issue of moral hazard, where this may be a slippery slope or what have you. I've heard this: rates are low, we should be borrowing long-term. This has been going on for 4 or 5 years now. There's absolutely no guarantee that the rates that we borrow at today are going to be higher or lower. Again, I want to reiterate that 3 or 4 years ago, there was a major push in the Finance Committee and the RTM to convince the BET to start borrowing long-term because, quote, rates were low. Well, they're a couple hundred basis points lower now than they were then. I'll be the first to admit, none of us in this room can predict interest rates. The real issue is spending. Our spending rate has probably gone up in terms of capital expenditures. I think we were averaging 45 to 50 million a year for 50 million a year for a number of years. This year, the budget guidelines are proposing to spend at least $70 million in capital expenses. That's almost a 40 to 45% increase. So far, the policy that we are using has been able to accommodate that level of spending. So as long as our spending doesn't get out of hand, I think that the current policy that we're using can in fact accommodate everything. Now, I'm not going to say never, never about long-term debt. There may be a situation in the future, unspecified at this particular point in time, where it is in the best interest, the best financial interest of the taxpayers of Greenwich to consider extending the debt. And I'm not talking about going out to 20 years. It could be something longer than the 7 years that we're currently doing. But the argument that we've got to borrow long-term now because rates are low, again, that's an argument that we've heard now for a number of years, and we have no idea where rates are going to be, a year from now or 5 years from now. Most importantly, people have to understand we only borrow what we're going to spend in a given year. We don't go out and borrow a lump sum of money and sock it away in the bank because rates are low and then spend it as we need. There are what are called arbitrage rules that prohibit us from doing that. As a matter of fact, the town retains a law firm to help us understand the arbitrage rules imposed on us by the Treasury Department. So we only borrow what we spend. And the idea that we can borrow a bunch of money while rates are low now it just doesn't work. We can't parlay that into a bank account and wait to spend it when the time is right. We borrow what we spend. What we're doing has worked fine. We finance things over about 7 years in total, sometimes longer depending upon when a project takes longer than 7 years to complete. So sometimes the financing can take 10, 11, 12 years from the time we initiate a project to the time we actually complete it. So we do have money that will mature well after a project has been completed. But when we issue debt, we issue it for 5 years. And so far in the history of the town, that has always worked well for us. It saved us a significant amount of interest, and it helps us in terms of not finding ourselves in a situation where we've borrowed so much money that we constrain ourselves in the future.
All right, and Democrat, Ms. Erickson, your response to the same question?
Yes, thank you. Quite simply, the job of the BET is to administer the financial affairs of the town. So what we need to do is oversee budgets, and once we decide on how we're going to spend our money, we need to decide how are we going to finance those uses of funds. Borrowing is one tool. It's a financial tool. It shouldn't be a political issue. It's not a Republican bond or a Democratic bond. What works best for the asset that we're financing. Yes, Mr. Basham's correct. We do a modified pay-as-you-go. We float a 2-year note, and then we refinance for 5 years. And that is what we've been doing, and it's worked. Except it hasn't, because now we have a huge backlog of capital projects, and we maybe need to look at things differently. We have guardrails in place for discipline. I'm not buying into the argument that if we allow ourselves to borrow long-term, that our spending is going to run rampant. No one on this board is going to let that happen. We are all financial professionals. We understand what happens when you borrow too much money and can't afford to pay it back. The reality is we have debt capacity. Other towns do long-term borrowing. We do long-term borrowing. We do it for sewers. We've done it for Nathaniel Witherell. And as Mr. Basham correctly points out, we finance the cash flows of the project, so a project could be much longer than the 7 years, depending on how the project is executed. I just want to point out that one such project that we floated last year to consider long-term bonding, maybe 10 years, I think was the suggested maturity, was the Greenwich High Fields remediation, which is a $24 million project over 3 years. And that idea didn't go over so well. But we're hoping we can have a constructive dialogue. Again, it's a financial tool. It shouldn't be politicized. It's just Finance 101. Thank you.
Additional comment by a Republican, somebody who hasn't spoken yet? All right.
Sorry.
All right, you're on.
Sorry.
Republican, yes.
Well, in answering the question, basically, you're asking whether we support long-term debt. And I would ask the residents of Greenwich, do we want our town to become another Hartford or Washington, D.C.? We've seen our state and federal government get drunk on debt, and Greenwich has always held the line on sensible borrowing. Has that made, for the towns that have a record of borrowing more and more, has that gotten the towns what they want done? No. Have they gotten better services or better roads? No. In fact, Hartford had to be bailed out by us taxpayers because of that policy. My question to the public is, should we be mortgaging our children's futures by taking on long-term debt? You know, quite frankly, the towns that have taken on long-term debt recently, like Darien, don't have the debt service that we have. They don't have the type of borrowing we have. So it may make sense to them. And for the things that we borrowed long-term for, like sewers and Nathaniel Witherell, we have a revenue stream to help pay that back. So, you know, where we do use it prudently, but quite frankly, our modified pay-as-you-go works. It's been proven to work. It's earned our town a AAA rating, and we should continue that policy.
Go ahead, Democrat.
Where to begin? So, this is really it has been going on for a long time. It's a politicization of a finance question. The issue of long-term borrowing, 20-year borrowing, is axiomatic. When you go out and buy your home, you don't buy it with a 5-year debt, you buy it with 20-year, 30-year debt, because the asset has a life of 30 years. It's normal financing. There are 9 municipalities in this state with AAA ratings, same as we have. All of them do long-term borrowing. Next. It isn't a question of increasing the amount of debt. There are strict debt policy limits in place that we adhere to, all of us adhere to. It isn't about that. It is simply about extending maturity of debt. So the question becomes, what's the will of the community? What is the wish of the community? What are the needs of the community? And how should those needs be met? If you want to stay with the modified pay-as-you-go, there's one key word there, and it's called pay. In the last several years, the appropriation for capital projects in this town has declined. That's not modified pay-as-you-go. That's not paying. And therefore, the projects cannot get done and will not get done. I'd also like to say a couple of other words. The question comes up on enrollment. The issue really is, the question is, Julian Curtis today has more students than it had 20 years ago. Yes, more. Several years ago, a number of years ago, it had many more students. The reason? There was mold at Hamilton Avenue School, and that forced the students from Hamilton Avenue School to double up and go to Julian Curtis School. So this issue of enrollment is something that clearly needs to be looked at, but it is very, very tricky and has to be looked at very carefully. So if you really want to make the comparison to Hartford, the question becomes, if you defer, and don't pay the maintenance and don't sustain these buildings, you'll have a pension problem like they have in Hartford, where they haven't paid as they went, and they kick the can down the road year after year after year. It doesn't have to be this way. Years ago, the leaders of the community, Republican, Democrat, they'd get together and they'd look at the needs and they'd say, let's prioritize. The question comes up about prioritization. It isn't the Board of Ed, it isn't the BET, it's the leadership in this community that has to determine what are the priorities. The capital, planning process in this town is broken. I think all of us would agree with that. And that process needs to be fixed, and mighty fast, because if we don't, there won't be any prioritization, and there'll be rancor and strife, and that's not helpful and unnecessary. These are not Republican or Democratic problems. They are community issues that will benefit from civil engagement, prioritization, and leadership. Thank you.
All right, and the next question, the first to respond will be Democrat Mr. Raymer, and this question does expand on what you've just been talking about.
Moving away from pay-as-you-go, Greenwich has incurred more short-term debt, and now some are suggesting long-term borrowing. What would the effect of such borrowing be on the town's bond rating, and what discipline should be exerted on our spending to ensure that the town does not end up in fiscal distress?
So there are about 169 towns in the state of Connecticut, and almost every single one of them, with one exception, uses a mix of maturities, usually matching the maturity of the bonds to the useful life of the asset that's being financed. The one exception, really, has been Greenwich, which prefers to use simply short-term bonds. Let's take a look at that for just a second. 5-year bonds today have an interest rate of about 0.55%. 15-year bonds have an interest rate of about 1.35%. If I had wanted to, and I'm not proposing it, but if I had wanted to, if I financed with 15-year debt, I could finance more than 2.5 times more capital projects with exactly the same capital expense, meaning amortization of principal and interest, as I would have financed with a 5-year bond with far less capital being done. But of course, there's a difference. At the end of the 5 years, had you done 5-year bonds, your debt would have been paid. If you use 15-year bonds, well, then you have 10 years left. And that's a debt overhang that can impair your ability to do financing of new projects at that point. Although, had you done the 15-year bonding, you would have done 2.5 times more projects initially, and those projects now would be fully paid off and done. And so the difference there becomes whether or not you have a confidence, whether or not you have a clairvoyance as to what are going to be all the capital projects you're going to be looking at over the next 20 years, or whether or not the other extreme, you feel like you're completely blind as to what projects will jump you over the years to come. The reality is that with the capital modeling that we do, we neither have the clairvoyance nor are we blind. The reality is that we're somewhere between. And yet we finance at the extreme of flexibility using only the 5-year bond. The use of a longer bond has certain clear advantages. For one thing, you finance a property with a longer bond, and you ask the taxpayers over a longer term to be paying for the benefit of that. 15 years of taxpayers will benefit from it. Why do just the first 5 years of taxpayers pay for the cost of it? Maybe the cost should be spread over more years. It was also pointed out that that you would do more projects more quickly if you did more projects but enjoyed the benefit of the longer-term bond. You may be able to take advantage of attractive interest rates by doing more projects with a longer-term bond at moments that the interest rates are lower. There's occasional periods of time during which the markets become distressed. Interest rates are at premium highs or capital is hard to obtain at all. If you're doing only short-term financing, that creates a hiatus for you that you are reluctant to or unable to go into the market and have an interruption in the flow of the financing. Had you done more of the financing with longer-term bonds, then you wouldn't have suffered that distress. The reality really is that the intelligent financing is for a mix of maturities, not all short-term, not all long-term. I certainly reject the notion that suddenly if we were doing some mix of maturities, some longer-term financing, that we suddenly would lose our discipline and lunge in and be doing more capital financing than we can afford. I don't believe that to be the case at all. I simply believe that we're losing an opportunity here to take advantage of attractive things in the market. And in doing that, we're the maverick. We're unlike the other 168 towns in the state of Connecticut. And when you're not following the conventional wisdom, sometimes it's worthwhile you're asking your question of, was I right or was I wrong?
Republican, Ms. Aurora, your response to the same question?
Thank you. I'm going to be short because I think my team has covered a lot of this, but I'm going to just speak a big picture here. Growing up, my family taught me if you can pay your bills on time, don't put them on your credit card, even if it's a 0% teaser rate. Our town has done a fantastic job paying our bills, both operational and capital, with our modified pay-as-you-go. Our BET needs to be congratulated for it and not vilified for it. Second idea here is that just because money is cheap, we don't need to take on any debt. We don't need to take on debt and find ways to spend it. I understand that we can borrow for 3% these days, and many of us are eager to borrow and spend. I fundamentally disagree with that. The third point, which gets brought up, is that, and I think this is what this question is getting at, is, if we take on long-term debt, maybe we can answer some of our capital school projects. And this is, I think I addressed some of this earlier, so I'm going to summarize this. Our school capital projects and some of our infrastructure projects that are being delayed, they're being constrained by prioritization and collaboration and project execution. They are not being constrained by the method of financing, which is, I think, the heart of the question here. Thank you.
Democrat response? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I think, firstly, as Mr. Raymer said, we really need to think about the mix that we deploy in our town and compare it to some of the other towns who have similar rating agencies. You know, I would ask Ms. Aurora, we talked about potentially Central Middle School coming up the pecking order and whether it should or should not. Can we think about what a $130 million building would be under 5-year bonding? We would simply just crowd out every other project. There's got to be opportunities and particular projects where it may be, like we do in sewers, like we do in Nathaniel Witherall, to extend that maturity. I'll only say that the GFOA, so the Government Finance Officers Association, who really comes up with a lot of policy about debt, et cetera, thinks that it is best practice to attach the life of the particular asset to the maturity of the bonding. So it is best practice according to the people who define basically how bonding and financial management work. I will also say that when you think about the rating agencies, how they rate us is a very complex math problem, of which debt is only 10%. So there's 90% that we do here in town, and we do it very well. There's 90% that can still keep ticking away. 10% is how our debt is structured, and that's a very low number, which means we could take out longer-term debt. We could even take on more debt, and it would not have any impact on our rating in multiples of in multiple projects. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead on the Republican side.
All these Democratic friends are good people who have the best interests of the town in mind. But let's have a little fun here. Ms. Erickson just said that no one would employ long-term debt to increase the spending. And Ms. Erickson, you ought to spend a little more time with Mr. Raymer, who sits next to you, who just said, if we use long-term debt, we could increase spending 2.5 times as much. That's exactly the risk we wish to avoid here. The town has done an excellent job in its low, short maturities. It's served really well. And yes, expanding maturities, this question is not about interest rates. It's about principle. Interest rates are at record lows these days. But when you load the town up with debt principal, you're just going to supersize its taxes. So the Republican approach to debt in this town has worked excellently for decades. It's a policy of short maturities, low amounts, and rapid repayment. That is what has kept our bond ratings excellent, our taxes low, and built the infrastructure that you enjoy. Let's think about this. Have you been to the beautiful Byram Pool recently? How about the beautiful new Coscob Park? How about the lovely New Lebanon School or Hamilton Avenue School? The infrastructure in this town is well preserved and has been well developed and maintained through our successful decade-long policy of short maturities and keeping the debts on you as a taxpayer low.
All right, next question, continuing in the same vein, and Mr. Drake, it's your turn to be first to answer the question. So Arjun, and this is the Republican response.
Do you agree that the BET should continue the practice of our town paying for projects rather than taking on long-term debt, keeping mill rates and taxes low? Why or why not?
I think I just answered that, but thank you for asking it. You know, as an individual here in this town, your share of the federal government's debt is $87,000 for every one of you. Your share of Connecticut's debt is $11,000 on each and every individual. That's the second highest in the nation. These are the heavy burdens of democratic governance and borrowing. All of this debt spells more and more taxation in the future. But in contrast, this town's debt, after the borrowing of last January, was $232 million only against our taxable base or grand list of $35 billion. That amounts to the town's debts, which are moderate, amount to $3,900 per capita. The contrast of your massive federal and state debts with your modest and manageable town of Greenwich debts is a direct result of longstanding Republican policy of using debt carefully in limited amounts with short maturities. This is one of the biggest successes of Republican management of our town's finances, and it's something the voters, we would hope, would wish to continue to see.
Democrat, Ms. Moriarty, your response?
So the debt policy, which governs how much we take out on debt and how much we're willing to incur for debt service, is tied to our decision-making on capital investment. And it's tied to the rest of our balance sheet, our fund balance. I would say that we are at a crossroads in this town, right? 3 years ago, we asked the Board of Education to do a study of its buildings, and its capital request, I believe, tripled as a result of that study. It was a very big number for us to look at. In prior administrations and prior BETs, there's been limit on the amount of spending both for maintenance and for capital projects. Capital projects came one at a time. You could only do one building at a time. You had to wait for it to be finished before you started the next one. And we had years and years of parents' advocacy at speaking at BET meetings about the need to replace Glenville School, the need to replace New Lebanon School. Eastern Greenwich Civic Center has been waiting for 20 years, I believe, on that list of projects to do. We restricted the amount of capital partly because of this limitation on debt. Now, I agree that we do not want to load the town's balance sheet with debt. However, there is room within our financials to increase the amount of debt and to be able to accelerate the projects that we need to do. And I think the term is flexibility. This board needs to reevaluate the types of projects maybe it would consider for long-term debt, to add it to the balance sheet. It is not converting everything to long-term debt, but it's flexible maturities. There are opportunities in the market, but we're not playing an interest rate game. We're trying to meet the needs of the community to develop and work on the infrastructure that we have ignored for years. Thank you.
Additional comment from the Republican side? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I would just add one thing. You know, when we talk about the town's liabilities, it's not just debt. Again, as has been noted, that our debt is well managed and it's short maturity. The town also has a very significant pension plan. Right now, the net present value of the liabilities in that pension plan, or the value of our future obligations, is over $600 million. That is not a 5-7 year average life. There are retirees there that are going to be getting payments over 50 years from now. So when we think about, and again, it doesn't get talked about as much, but the fact is the town does have very significant long-term liabilities. And I would note, we are not kicking the can down the road on these liabilities. This BET, both Republican and Democrat, have fully funded all actuarially required funding needs on a yearly basis, and the pension plan is now over 90% funded, due to that work. But this is something critical that we need to focus on. It isn't just the debt that the taxpayers are on the hook for. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
So this is actually a good debate, an interesting debate. I think the people watching will get a good picture. There are those on one side who say things are working perfectly, everything is great, and it's working perfectly. And there are those on the other side who say it's a wonderful town, we're blessed to live here. I have my grandchildren at school here. I've been here 35 years. We all love this town, and it has worked well, but there are many new issues and problems that we need to open our eyes to. Now, the question on the retirement plan is an interesting one, because there's an example of something that has been working pretty well, actually. So the retirement board is an independent board. The performance of the retirement fund was really great last year. I think it went up over 28%, phenomenal. The markets have gone up. It's been a good year. Retirement Board has become more conservative, which is good. They've reduced the discount rate to 6%, which is good. The lower that is, the lower the the lower the yield that you have to get from your investment portfolio to meet the obligations going forward. From a market value perspective, not an actuarial perspective, but a market value perspective, the Retirement Board is actually funded at almost 90%. From an actuarial, it's about 80%. So there is a unfunded component, but we are by far, and this is due to great management over the course of many years by all involved, in pretty good shape. 80% funding actuarially is not bad. And if we stick to this, we pay about $28 million a year to retire that and to pay the normal costs of the retirement plan. But that $28 million should shrink and go down very, very quickly. And also, with the new contract with fire, none of the active employees will be on the defined benefit plan. So this is a wonderful example, really wonderful example of when people in the town get together, work on these problems, they get addressed, and they get addressed well. Why? Because we have very talented, capable, dedicated people here. But what you're seeing here in this debate is a little bit of a difference in philosophy. And listen, the schools came up with a plan. They were asked to. They said our needs over the next 20 years are going to be $600 million. You may say that's too much. Maybe it is too much. I'm not saying it's the right number, but it's caused the capital project pipeline to double in the last 3 years from 600 to $1.2 billion. If you discount that by any percent, you still have a wall of projects that have been deferred, like Eastern Greenwich Civic Center or the schools. And if they don't get addressed, if they don't get fixed, it will cost more in the future, and it will cost much more in the way of taxes. So if you don't want to tax people, if you don't want to extend the debt, not the amount of debt, but just extend the maturity, not the amount of borrowing, then you're going to wind up with a problem down the road, or else these projects will never get done.
All right, thank you. And the next question, Republican Ms. Vasiliotis, you're the first to respond.
The town's annual capital budget is limited and the town's needs are extensive. Some projects are funded by a combination of taxpayer and private money. Some projects viewed as public-private partnerships have moved up in priority over projects solely funded by taxpayer money. Is this appropriate?
Well, I'm not sure what is being referred to as some projects have moved up over others in priority because of public-private partnerships. I mean, the one public-private partnership that we have is at Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, and that's been over 20 years in the making. I was part of that, the group that came up with the final specifications, et cetera, as a BET representative. And, it really is a collaborative effort. We've had many public hearings, and I think we'll have a building that we can be proud of. And just to address one comment that was made, that Eastern Greenwich Civic Center was a victim of short-term borrowing. That certainly wasn't the case. The Eastern Greenwich Civic Center was the subject of long debates back and forth for many years as to what was going to be built, where, whether it should be built there, whether it should be replaced, et cetera, et cetera. So that particular building, we finally have gotten. With respect to other projects, we fund them as, as they come to us, and certainly it's the first selectman's job to prioritize those projects, and we go through them as he prioritizes them. He is responsible ultimately to give us the capital projects that he thinks needs to be done. Just on Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, too, I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the Cohens for their $5 million gift. It was very generous of them, and I like the condition of them saying, just build it. So I'll leave it at that.
And Democrat, Mr. Weisbrod, your response to the question?
I'm just going to say that let's not let this become a debate about long-term debt, short-term debt. These are technical questions that many out there may be, rolling their eyes on. The real issue is, do we need to do things to maintain the community or not? And there's no, if you don't borrow in a long-term fashion, keeping the debt amount low, you have to tax. And if you tax, what we've seen over the last several years has been a very herky-jerky movement in the mill rate. So one year the mill rate goes down 80 basis points. The next year it's flat. It moves with some volatility from year to year. I think what's needed is for the leaders of the community to get together and say, look, we know there's a 2% or so contract increase in labor. Labor is the bulk of our cost on the operating side. That's given. We've signed these contracts. The unions, they need the payments, the wages need to be made. It's 2% there. We need X percent to contribute, whether you like modified pay as you go, that's fine, but X percent of the budget has to go to capital tax appropriations. You get an agreement. And you stick to it for a number of years. You say, okay, this is the range that and that's how this town was run for many, many years, until now we seem to have lost that skill. And then these are not radical requirements. And then over time, you build up the amount of the capital pool, you meet the needs in the operating, and it's steady state. There's been so much stress and anxiety in this community needlessly, truly needlessly. I mean, during all these school debates, we got over 1,000 emails from irate parents who are anxious and nervous and worried. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? That's unnecessary, because I do believe that everyone on this board wants to do the right thing for the students and for the, for the schools. But if you go through this a herky-jerky, kind of a disorganized approach, it needlessly creates stress, anxiety, strife, rancor, unnecessary, completely unnecessary. Thank you.
Yes, on the Republican side, yeah.
Yes, thank you. We want to thank the very many generous Greenwich residents who contribute to what we call public-private partnerships, but might also be called, gifts to the town to help us reduce the costs of our projects. And we've actually seen, several of those over the last decade plus. We have MISA, which is funded by a combination of generous gifts for, and identified particularly for rooms and other needed things to upgrade that project. It was also complemented by additional state reimbursement, school reimbursement funding that reduces our required debt. And just to make a comment, we talked about borrowing in tranches. The MISA debt actually extends over 16 years. We have another example is Nathaniel Witherall. That too is a combination of generous gifts from our residents in town towards a needed facility for our elderly, as well as historic tax credits, as well as, again, particular state funding available for nursing home constructions. We had the Byram Pool, again, generous gifts, as another example. The recent contribution of the bicycles for Greenwich Avenue is another. So these all combine to make our projects more affordable. We can't forget that approximately 30% of our residents in town are Alice families, and those are, asset limited income whatever. So it's important that we blend these things, and I'm not aware of any project being prioritized because the funding was coming in, but we certainly are very grateful as a town and as a BET that we have this wonderful blend of contributions that we also call public-private partnerships.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I think that we need to be careful a little bit in how we structure gifts, in the sense that there is no current policy in the town for the acceptance of gifts or how to handle public-private partnerships. The BET has asked the first selectman at least 2 years in a row, I believe, in guidelines that a policy needs to be developed, and I think this latest gift for Eastern Greenwich Civic Center showed the need that a policy does need to be developed. We have to be clear about what the guidelines are for any town officer to start discussing potential quid pro quos, which didn't occur in this Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, but in potentially other ones. But the town's acceptance of gifts, it has been a little bit of an uneven process. The Byron Pool, if I remember correctly, didn't make it to the capital plan until the Junior League stepped up and promised a gift. The Eastern Greenwich Civic Center has a condition in this year's budget that was voted on 7-6 by the Republican majority that required a substantial donation. So I think we're sending out different messages. Is the town going to be responsible for its own infrastructure and buildings, or is the town relying on outside gifts to do what it should be doing all along?
All right, and believe it or not, the time has come for closing statements. So I would ask the timers to clear their watches. Each of the candidates who have been selected to give a closing statement will have 3 minutes. The Democrats will be first, and we will alternate between the Democrats and the Republicans. And I believe, Jeff Raymer, you are the first to give your 3-minute closing statement.
So judge the candidates by their voting record. Don't be swayed by their posturing in the newspapers or their expressions of good intentions here tonight. Look instead at the votes and see what people really stand for when the chips are down and they're casting the vote. Funding for flood preparedness, for example, came for a vote 3 times. In March of 2018, in April of 2020, and in April again of 2021. And each of those occasions, the 6 Democrats voted in favor of establishing a flood preparedness plan. The 6 Republicans voted against it with their tie-breaking vote, reducing the funding to 0. There is no plan. The renovation of the Julian Curtis School. In 2020, the $2.6 million of funding was reduced to 0 by the 6 Republicans and their tie-breaking vote. In 2021, the $1.7 million of architectural and engineering funds was reduced by the 6 Republicans and their tie-breaking vote to a modest $200,000, throwing the sum back into the lap of the school board. At North Miami School in the ceiling collapse, the 6 Republicans and their tie-breaking vote voted for a delay, but for the outcry from the community, I don't know where that project would be today. Fire response to the northwest and north sections, which have been deficient for years. The 6 Republicans in their tie-breaking vote voted to reduce to 0 the funding which would have been used to weigh and study the recommendations of Matrix Consulting, the town's consultant for this purpose, which was recommending that a career station be established at Round Hill to better serve and to more promptly serve fire response to the Northeast. There'll be nothing. There's no funding for it. It's tabled for yet another year. Central Middle School. 2 years ago, we spent $1 million to replace the failing pillars in the basement. We have, as been spoken, we have sensors on the walls to remind us of when walls are moving. And yet, when we asked for funding for engineering help to look at the condition, that funding was reduced to 0 by 6 Republicans in their tie-breaking vote. Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, 6 Democrats voted to fund with $18.7 million absolutely. The Republicans, with their tie-breaking vote, pulled those funds back and have conditioned it upon there being gifts and approval of the business plan. We understand low taxes. During our years in which we ran the tie-breaking vote, vote, our tax increases were 0% and 2.75%. But the function of the BET is not to have mindlessly low mill rate. The function of the BET is a balancing of low taxes against a level of services which make this a community in which we want to live. Who
Thank
should you
you, but
vote
your
for?
time is up.
You should vote for the people who vote for the things that you want to see in this community.
Thank you very much. And next with the closing statement is Republican Mike Basham.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking the League for sponsoring this debate, and I hope everyone watching has found it helpful. Notwithstanding what you hear around town about how bad things are, Greenwich is a wonderful community in which to live and raise a family. We enjoy the benefits of incredible natural beauty, a distinctive combination of coastal, suburban, and country living, the best funded school system in Connecticut, excellent police and fire protection, wonderful parks, a nationally recognized museum, affordable property taxes, and a strong balance sheet that provides us with a AAA credit rating. The surge of new residents moving here over the last year only confirms that we're truly blessed to call this town our home. Many of the benefits we enjoy today are the result of strong fiscal management by the Board of Estimate and Taxation, led over the years by Republicans. While Greenwich is perceived locally and nationally as one of the nation's wealthiest communities, the reality is that our town is much more economically diverse. All of our taxpayers expect and deserve a responsible approach to managing the town's finances. Balancing the wants and needs of the different constituencies in our town is not easy. As BET members, our job is to manage our finances while doing our best to address the many calls for improved services and more capital spending. Evaluating these requests and separating the wants from the needs is always challenging. As difficult as many of these decisions are, our goal is to make sure the town does not succumb to the runaway spending and fiscal mismanagement exhibited in Hartford. Affordable taxes and sound infrastructure and quality services are not mutually exclusive. Over the years, Republican-led BETs have proven that it is possible to have both. Our schools are the best funded in the state, and our teachers are the best compensated. We all want the best school infrastructure. The debate is only about the proper prioritization of projects. During the last 14 years, which included the Great Recession and the pandemic, we have invested over $730 million to maintain and build first-class infrastructure. All of this has been done while keeping our taxes affordable for everyone. This is a legacy that we all benefit from and can be proud of. Our Republican team is committed to being fiscally disciplined and working collaboratively to deliver best-in-class schools, services, and amenities in our community. The First Selectman, our Democratic colleagues, the Board of Education, school and town administrators and department heads, parent-teacher associations, and other involved citizens groups all play a critical role in helping make this process successful. You have our commitment that we will not be the source of the rancor and divisiveness we have all experienced too much over the last few years. Sound, fair, and responsible decisions can be achieved through respectful, meaningful, and forthright discussion and debate. Our taxpayers expect and deserve the very best from all of us. You have our promise that we will work hard to provide all of our citizens with the best services and education possible. Nisha, Karen, Leslie, Dan, Bill, and I respectfully ask for your votes next Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Democrat Leslie Moriarty. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. First, I want to
Oh, you need to turn on your microphone.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Greenwich for hosting this debate, and thank you, Kay Maxwell and Arjun Kishore, for your assistance tonight. And I want to thank the public for tuning in to learn about the differences between the Democratic and Republican slate of candidates for the BET. The BET's agendas typically look mundane, but the issues we deal with have a direct impact on our residents, and its leadership matters. Compared to many other municipalities, Greenwich has an enviable financial situation. The town's cash reserves are at their highest level, our pension fund is on stable footing, and our mill rates are the second lowest in the state. This would be good news, except for the fact that our resources are not being used to address our challenges. We need to keep pace with educational mandates and academic achievement targets. We need to keep pace with increasing strains on our stormwater infrastructure and plan for future flooding risks. We need to address our aging school facilities, fixing issues of security, accessibility, and air quality, while also bringing them up to modern educational standards so that our facilities reflect the quality of our teachers. Our schools don't need saving, they need support. We need to provide appropriate police and fire coverage to all. We need to address energy conservation and sustainability efforts. We need to provide quality of life improvements like bicycle routes and better playing fields. And we need to support senior citizens and provide a safety net for residents in need. Greenwich needs strong leadership and a commitment to effective planning. We need to take action to address these challenges, probably not all at once, and within acceptable financial parameters to maintain our strong financial position and low mill rates. The Democratic candidates will bring the responsible and responsive leadership that's needed. We will focus on making progress with action, not delays. We'll foster collaboration, communication, and transparency to decrease the rancor and bring a laser focus on the critical issues. The goal of the 6 Democratic candidates is to keep Greenwich as a community in which we all want to live, one that serves our children, our teens, adults, and seniors, and one that continues to attract new families. So that Greenwich can move forward together, we ask you to vote for all 6 Democratic candidates for the BET. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, Republican Nisha Aurora, 3 minutes.
Thank you. On behalf of my Republican caucus, I would like to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting tonight's debate and Kay Maxwell for moderating. It's an honor to be your Republican BET candidates and have the opportunity to serve. I'd also like to thank our esteemed colleagues on the other side for their dedication and service, and I look forward to working together. Our Republican team brings the best of both worlds. 3 of us are incumbents, and 3 of us, including myself, bring a fresh perspective. We have a deep bench. We bring institutional and town knowledge, and we bring new ideas. Our caucus brings an understanding and experience and is dedicated to making our town better for every resident. We bring a diversity of backgrounds and skill sets. My colleague Mike was born in Michigan, educated down south, and worked in Washington as a senior Treasury official. Karen was born in the Bronx, has a PhD in toxicology, and is a practicing attorney. Bill is a second-generation Greenwich resident and has a business degree from Harvard. Dan went to New York City public schools, a graduate from Stuyvesant and Columbia University. Leslie spent decades in investment banking and was a woman in finance when being a woman in business was not easy. I'm an engineer by background and spent 20 years in the private sector managing technology and operations. Now we come together as Republican candidates for the Greenwich Board of Estimate and Taxation. We cherish our differences and are united in our resolution to keep Greenwich the best town to live, raise a family, and retire. This team brings diverse perspectives and believes that when we come with an open mind and we collaborate with all of our members, we will come to the best solution. Our platform is simple. We want to ensure that this town continues to provide the highest level of town services and education for our residents. We want our taxes to stay reasonable. We want zoning to stay local, and we want our town to be affordable. We will invest in technology, identify ways to improve services so that our individuals and businesses want to make Greenwich their home. We want to modernize our schools and our town infrastructure. We believe that if we prioritize our needs and execute well, we will get the job done. We'll ask tough questions, demand accountability, and hope to deliver exceptional results that our community deserves. I came to this country as a 6-year-old from India, and I've lived the classic immigrant American story. My parents, both highly educated, came to this country to provide the children the best education. For me, those were public schools in Delaware, public universities in New Jersey, and nonprofits that supported my family along the way. I am forever indebted to my parents and the community that gave me the opportunity to succeed. My experience has framed my personal philosophy in raising a family, serving my community, and making impact. Our caucus is committed to working together to provide the best schools and the best town services. We promise to promote open and transparent discussion and ideas and make it a true team enterprise. We intend to serve with our minds and our hearts. We, the Republican caucus, ask for your support and vote. We will make you proud. Next Tuesday, vote for all 6 Republican BET members. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, all of you candidates, for not only being here this evening, but for being willing to give of your time and talents. It's one of the wonderful things about Greenwich, and you're all to be commended for all that you do for the town. Thank you also to the timers this evening and to Arjun for posing our questions, and especially to the public who submitted the questions in advance so that you did address the things that were of concern to the public. Again, thank you so much, and everyone, obviously, don't forget to vote on November 2nd.